University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'm a master's student, and I got my bachelor's through the pandemic, so that's the only reason I know Zoom so well. Let me make sure that I'm sharing. Hang on one second. Okay. So today I'd like to share with you about my study looking at the institutional trust in the case of the Red Hill water contamination. On November 29th, 2021, the Hawaii Department of Health issued a press release recommending all Navy water system users avoid using their water for drinking, cooking, and oral hygiene. Anyone using their water that has a fuel odor should also refrain from using the water for bathing, dishwashing, and laundry. This alert came due to calls in and stating that there was a fuel-like odor within the water system. The Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility, built during World War II, is located east of Pearl Harbor in an area known locally as Kapukaki. There are 20 underground fuel storage tanks designed to contain various types of fuel. The facility can hold up to 250 million gallons of fuel total and sits just 100 feet above the sole source aquifer for the island of Oahu. Leaks have been documented by the Navy as early as 1947, resulting in an unknown amount of environmental toxic contamination. As you can see here, one tank is large enough to house the Aloha Tower, for those of you who have seen this local landmark. However, in comparison to other well-known international landmarks, one Red Hill fuel tank is similar in height to the Statue of Liberty and nearly half the size of the Statue of Unity in India, the world's largest statue. Bear in mind, there are 20 of these sitting 100 feet above our aquifer. When the leak in November 2021 occurred, the water for over 93,000 users, several businesses, and a lot of elementary schools between 7 and 13. I'm not exactly sure on the number because there's question as to how far the water line goes. The water was contaminated when nearly 20,000 gallons of jet fuel and other chemicals leaked from the Naval Underground Fuel Storage Facility. I live on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, right in the middle of the Navy water line. I drank water contaminated with jet fuel because the water utility company, the US Navy, not only failed to warn me of the contamination, but assured me that my area was not impacted because my water never had fuel-like odors, despite having an oily sheen. In the beginning of the crisis, I watched as military leadership laid out critical guidance for community health and safety. I clung onto their statements about standards for water safety and entrusted mine and my children's health to their capable hands for protection. As the 4-month exposure period unfolded, official accounts from the military leadership revealed inconsistencies between the public narrative and my community's lived experience, despite the many calls from impacted neighbors to the poison control line and nurse helpline and visits to the ER for acute health impacts. The voice of the Navy waterline user was disregarded and publicly belittled by saying the event was non-emergent and that health symptoms were psychosomatic. It was at this point that I decided to focus my attention on researching the impacts to my community in a way that elevated community voices, fostered resilience, and empowered waterline users to participate in research that allowed their story to be told exactly how they experienced it. Due to all of this, public trust in the military has deteriorated. Their public image was shaped by the perceptions of mismanagement, deceptions, and a lack of empathy. This is important because how the public perceives the military is critical. These perceptions impact the image of our national power, decisions about defense spending, and even decisions about our country's use of force. The relationship between the general public and the military is one that is not only studied interdisciplinarily, but also by public opinion pollsters, politicians, and decision makers. Views of military personnel can range from heroic warriors to at times executioners carrying out vicious acts. A study conducted by the UH Economic Research Organization, or UHERO, and the Water Resources Research Center shows that in the aftermath of the Red Hill crisis, Public satisfaction of the Navy's response tactics were significantly lower for the military, especially the Navy, when compared to other local, state, and federal institutional stakeholders and responders. The erosion of trust in the military was so evident that Rear Admiral Kavanaugh called for action during the Navy's command investigation, declaring trust restoration to be a moral obligation. I wondered how the impacted people felt about trust restoration and sought their input on if this was possible and how they perceived it could be done given Hawaii's history of militarization within the U.S. empire. Hawaii's history of the U.S. military is contextualized with bipolar extremes ranging from the illegal overthrow of a sovereign nation in 1883 to the military being the #2 economic driving force next to tourism today. This drastically impacts Hawaii's landscape. Of the 250,000 total DoD force and family members population in Hawaii, 90% live on Oahu, and 22% of the island's land is controlled by the Department of Defense. Simply put, the military has become a factor that significantly impacts communities across Hawaii. The goal of this study was simple: to document the lived experiences of individuals impacted by contaminated water using a community-centered approach to highlight ways that crisis response tactics impact trust after environmental crisis. I set out to answer these primary questions. I can't move the picture. Basically, which factors shaped the Navy's waterline users' expectations regarding how the military would respond to the crisis? What the consequence has been of unmet crisis response expectations, and finally, to solicit community member input in defining the necessary conditions for a trusting DoD community relationship. I employed a qualitative case study design which empowered and protected participants by employing a trauma-informed approach and obtaining a certificate of confidentiality, which guarantees legal protection of all personally identifying information in the sample group. I conducted 23 interviews with adult Navy waterline users as a subset of the aforementioned UHERO and WRRC study, after having them complete a short pre-interview survey for quantitative and qualitative data, so to allow for depth and flexibility in responses. Analysis of those transcripts is still ongoing, but I'd like to share some of my preliminary findings today. For the question, what factors shaped the expectations of Navy waterline users? Navy waterline users' expectations of the military response tactics to the Red Hill water contamination have to do with the multifaceted role that the military has in their lives and their contributions to the military overall. The majority of participants are affiliated with the military in some way: actively serving, dependents, distant family members who live with those dependents while the service member is away, retirees, and DoD employee civilians. Respondents in this category spoke of the military in more than water provider. Data reveals employer, housing provider, insurance provider, medical personnel, social network facility, and a large number of participants responded with a disjointed concept of home when I asked the participants to just describe the place where you call home. Participants, regardless of military affiliation, overwhelmingly shared their perception of the military as being the ones who are supposed to help, and this was not demonstrated in the aftermath. Regarding consequences of unmet expectations, what I'm finding is a disparity between what was expected and the actual crisis response tactics, which resulted in a significant emotional and relational consequences. The participants discuss a distrust and even perceived betrayal with the institution of the military, and this gap between these expectations and reality has highlighted and in some cases intensified the tensions regarding the military's influence on community stakeholders and responses from other institutions. Finally, interviewees have indicated a lack of confidence that trust can be restored on interpersonal and institutional levels. By asking participants to contribute to a collective sentiment that indicates from the community perspective what would need to exist in the military-public relationship if trust were to be restored, these are the key elements that are discussed. Transparency and honesty is something that respondents all repeatedly spoke of that was probably the highest response so far. Accountability and receptive leadership, empathy, cultural sensitivity, not only for individual experiences, but for the land and way that has shaped food security and other portions of everyday life here on the island. Consistency and reliability, these behaviors can't just happen for a short period, they need to be ongoing and demonstrated past the immediate response period. And then a two-sided effort in the relationship between DoD and community. One of the operational definitions that I am working with shows that trust can be ethnographically measured by the willingness by both parties or all parties to contribute to collaboration. And so this is the two-sided effort. Future interests. With this, I can just say that the overarching main result of this study is that we need to know more about institutional trust, specifically how it pertains to the military. This institution is unlike other institutions in the community. It's more than an employer. It's more than your housing provider. There's a fear of retaliation for speaking out against ill harm, not only by employees, but even just a community whose #1 economic driving force is the military. There's a lot at stake when you raise these questions and concerns. Future interest, I would like to understand with that question that I'm asking of the community on the water line, what is necessary to exist in the relationship for trust to exist. I'd like to re-interview that water line so that we can see a longitudinal response and see how that changes over time given the continued response tactics by the military. But I'd also like to interview people off the water line who their daily life and sense of security is also disrupted by this event. I would also like to get input from other institutional stakeholders and do focus groups with those organizations, such as the EPA. They've been very involved here in Hawaii, and they have intimate knowledge of this relationship at this point, certain members. As well, the Department of Health, the Board of Water Supply, which is the primary utility for water in this state and on this island. I can't speak for other islands personally, and so on. Finally, a big area of interest for me is what exists in the absence of trust. As trust is eroded, there is an assumption that's easy to make that distrust is what is left behind. But I would argue, and you can find the argument supported both ways in literature, that the absence of trust isn't necessarily distrust, as if one exclusively goes down as the other exclusively goes up. I can say that I trust the Navy to protect me in times of war, but I don't trust them to provide water for me to bathe in. Those two things can coexist, and those two constructs can be measured individually. So what exists when trust is eroded, but I can still trust this institution in other capacities? I feel that that is something that is critical to look at, specifically in regards to the military, given the ramifications of the public perception of the military. Thank you. I want to thank my committee members and my mentors and my family for listening to me practice a bunch. The College of Social Sciences Geography Department, UHERO, WRRC, and the Hawaii Department of Health for their contributions and support in this, and also the UH Red Hill Task Force.